Hello there. Today we are going to talk about the MVC architecture. The MVC architecture is one of the most used architecture in the world for software development, and that's why we are going to talk about this MVC architecture today. MVC architecture has three different components: the model, view and the controller. As its name suggests, MVC model, V for view and C for controller. So we are going to talk about these model, view, controller in deep, and then I will give you a proper example of employee management so that it would be very easier for you to understand that how to implement MVC architecture or how to develop a software on MVC or based on MVC architecture using Java programming language or Python programming language. So let's see that what are the components of MVC architecture and how you can implement it. So first, MVC. First component of MVC is model. Model represents all those classes that you are going to create for the data layer or business layer. This is most important thing that you should know. What is data layer? Data layer has those classes which are dealing with the data. Like if you are having database, then retrieving the data from the database, adding the data into the database, means all the things on the lower level of the software. All the classes on the lower level of the software are related to the data layer, and business layer has those classes in which you have implemented the business logic. So you should have to study about it. It is not that much difficult. Business layer is quite easier. Business layer use the functions of data layer to do the work of presentation layer. Presentation layer means the view. So just don't worry about this data layer. Let me write it here: data layer, business layer, business layer. So this business layer and data layer classes comes under model component of MVC architecture, and that's why model can also be said as the model component of MVC architecture deal with the data of the software. If we talk about the view or view component, then view component is completely the front end. The view component completely deals with, or it represents all the front end files or the complete front end basically, like the HTML file, CSS file, or the JavaScript, and let's say JSP in context to Java programming language, and many more. So complete front end comes under the view or the view component of MVC architecture. Now the most important thing is controller. Controller plays a very important role in MVC architecture because it uses the model as well as view according to the request of the user. Like you are the user who wants to add an employee. This is the user interface in front of you, and you want to add an employee. This is the employee management program. Just assume that employee management program, and you want to add employee. So what you will do, you will click add employee, add. You will click this button. So when you will click this button, so a request would be arrived. That request would be sent to the controller. That controller is responsible for verifying the request, and after verifying the request, it will ask the model. It will ask the model to add the data into the database, and after adding the data into the database, this model will send response to the controller that I have added the data, and then this controller will send that specific response to the user interface to show on that specific user face in front of that user that employee has been added with specific employee ID. So that's what the work of controller. Controller is most important component between these model and view. It basically use this model and view components for the smooth interaction between user and the back end of the software. So I hope this thing is clear. What is MVC, model, view and controller is clear. Now let's talk about the actual thing as a software developer. Like if you are a software developer, then what you should know about the model, view, controller. If we talk about the specific classes which are present behind the scene or like backend. So model is the part of backend, and controller is also a part of backend. Model and controller, both of these things are backend but not related to each other, because this is different thing and this is different thing. This contains data layer and business layer, and controller is completely different. These are the classes which are responsible for accepting the request, and after accepting the request, it will forward the specific request according to the request comes from the user. So that's what the meaning of this, and the only part which is front end is the view. Now let me tell you the biggest reason that why MVC architecture is used. Like if you want to separate the backend developers and front-end developers, like you are having the developers who only know the backend services or who only know to develop the backend, then you can separate that backend developer and you can separate the front-end developers separately, or they will work independently according to their pace. That's why MVC architecture is used. It is strictly restricted to combine the work of front end and the back end. Now let me show you a proper example of employee management for understanding the MVC architecture. So here, for creating the model component, you will have to create several classes related to the data layer and business layer. Like you need to add the data of an employee. So employee will have an employee ID, name and date of birth, DOB. These three things, that employee will have these three things or many things like that. I am just giving you the example, so just assume that it has three things, or these three things would be added into the employee's data. So what will happen is, in the data layer we will have to connect a database. So let's assume that we will be using the MySQL. So in MySQL we will have to create a table employee which would be having these three columns: ID, name and date of birth. So for handling or for CRUD operation or for performing the CRUD operations on that database, we will have to create a specific manager class. So that manager class would also be included in the model itself, and for adding, for deleting and for updating, all those things are important. So the employee DAO, data access object, would also be created or developed in the model, and the data transfer object classes would also be created in the model component. So all these type of classes would be created inside the model component. After that, we need to create the view. And remember, one of the most important thing, this is completely a part of backend. So backend part or backend classes will not have anything about the front end. Means it is strictly restricted in MVC architecture that if you are creating backend, then your backend code will not have any front end part. Otherwise you are breaking the rule of MVC architecture. So that's why if you are coding or if you are programming the backend or if you are developing the backend, then your backend code should not have any front end part. And in the same way, if you are creating the view component, so basically view component is the front end part. So if you are creating view, then your view code or your front end code should not have any backend code. Then only it is following the model view architecture. So model view architecture, in context to the employee, we will have to create many HTML or index.html, index.jsp like these classes. So all these files are need to be created in context to the view component. So I hope these things are clear. And now the most important thing comes into the picture is the controller classes. Controller classes are the servlet classes that we create in Java programming language. I hope you know, if you have you ever created any web application in Java, then you have created some type of servlets and you have done the servlet mapping as well. So the servlet classes are the controller classes which are controlling the request, which are handling the input from the user, and according to the specific input it will forward the request to a specific backend class for performing the CRUD operations into the database. So I hope all these things are clear. Controller is most important thing. Controller handles the input, process that input and send or forward that specific input to the DAO or DTO classes for the further processing. Now let me give you a small example for the controller class also. So just assume that when user is clicking the add button for adding the employee into the database, so when he will click the add, so an add employee /add employee, this is the part of front end that when we click the add button, then for this URL pattern the request should go. So a request has been arrived by add employee URL pattern. So as we have already mapped that when we are creating the Java web application, then we map the URL pattern with a specific servlet class. So let's assume that that class is add employee.java. So for add employee.java, the request will go, and that add employee.java would be executed, and according to the code that you have written in that add employee.java, all the things would be executed. And in this add employee.java, you will call all the DAO classes functions for saving the data into the database which has come with the request. So this is the basic thing that I want to tell you about the MVC architecture. I hope all these things are clear in this session. And if you are having any doubt related to this controller classes, model classes or view classes, then you can comment below. I will try to get to you as soon as possible. Thank you.